Hi everyone, this is Elaine. Welcome to Flat Earth for Dummies 101. Definition of dummy, indoctrinated in globe from birth. A spinning globe is only true in fairy tales. Only the truth will set you free. The lies were out to get me, to feast upon my brain. Freemasonic wormholes were to blame. Then I saw the way. Now I'm a flat earther. There is no curve, no globe in my mind. The earth is flat. We're the believers, don't eat the deceivers, those who lie.
The demonstrations you have just witnessed of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity supports the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
Dr. Brown's point is what we discussed in part 1. When we look at the shapes of the oceanic ridges against the major mountain chains, they fit more like a glove in shape, direction, and contour than the actual continents themselves do in the Pangea theory. And what would happen to the ground if subsonic and supersonic winds hit an Earth full of trees that were not 20 feet high, but 20 to 60 miles high, with an interconnected root system deeply entrenched in the ground? Could this be the mechanism that caused the cracks in the Earth in Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory? Could this be why none of the ancient megatrees are left standing today? Were they literally ripped out of the ground by the roots, by supersonic winds and the ensuing worldwide flood? If trees are carbon-based, why are petrified organic matter 90% silica? On the Jesuit periodic table of theoretical atomic particle elements, carbon and silicon sit right next to each other in group 14, the carbon family. The key difference between silicon and carbon is that carbon is non-metal, whereas silicon is a metalloid. They define a metalloid as an imprecise term used to describe a chemical element that forms a simple substance having properties intermediate between those of a typical metal and a typical non-metal. There is no single property which can be used to unambiguously identify an element as a metalloid. Well, that clears everything up. Thanks for that.
And it doesn't take long for things to petrify, not at all. Things can petrify very quickly. We've got some examples here on the table of things that petrified very quickly. I'll show you those in a second. Here's a picture of a petrified water wheel. Here's petrified firewood. It was chopped on before it got petrified. You can go to Southern Forest World Museum in Georgia, Waycross, Georgia. There's a mummified dog stuck inside a tree. Some people say it's petrified. I don't know if it's mummified. I've not been there yet. But anyway, how can a dog get mummified just in probably a few years? Chased a coon up the tree, got stuck. They named it Stucky, of course. That's the name for the dog. They had a contest to name it, and so they called it Stucky. They cut the tree down for firewood. There's a dog inside. Here's a petrified cowboy boot with the cowboy's legs still in it. The boot was made in the 1950s. Got his leg shot off or torn off or who knows what, but there's his leg petrified. Here's a petrified fish giving birth. A petrified hammer was found from a marine barracks from World War II. Petrified hammer. Petrified hat found in New Zealand. Here's a kid, a kid sent me this right here on the table, a petrified crayon found in Arizona. I mean, the crayon is turned to stone. We have right here a petrified pickle. It's in our museum. Well, it's here tonight, but a guy sent me this and the jar with it. The jar is still in our museum. He said, Reverend Hovind, I found this old house in Montana. The roof was gone. The house had been empty at least 30 years. But we were digging around through what's left of this house and found the pantry. And there were pickle jars in there, but the lid to one of the jars rusted, and the pickle inside turned to stone. Would you like it for your museum? I said, well, yeah, of course. One kid wrote me a letter. Here's the letter right here. He said, Brother Hovind, I was 8 years old doing a science experiment. I put a bunch of acorns in a bucket of water to see if they would sprout. And I forgot about them. A year later, my mom saw the bucket on the back porch. She said, get rid of that bucket and all that junk out there. He said, the acorns had turned to stone in 1 year. I have right here a baggie of petrified acorns. It doesn't take long, folks. Don't let them tell you it takes millions of years for things to petrify. It's not true. The doctor died and they buried him. 14 years later, his wife died. This is back in 1881. They dug a hole to bury Grandma, and water went into the hole. And they thought, oh, we don't want to bury Grandma in the water, so they buried her someplace else. And then the kids got worried about Grandpa in that moving water. It hit an underground spring, apparently. So they dug up Grandpa. He'd been in the ground 14 years. And the article says, the occupant of the coffin had been turned to stone, presumably as a result of the continual flow of water. It said the arms had rotted off, but the rest of the body had turned to stone, petrified. So the Bible says the high hills were covered. The earth was totally covered by a flood. 15 cubits, that's about 22 feet, over the mountains. So the skeptics say, where'd all the water go? Oh, it's still here. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 8, the water's assuaged. That means to drop down, to sink down. If we filled this room 4 feet deep in water, and then all of a sudden the floor caved in over here and dropped down 10 feet, that's going to suck all the water from there into the hole. Well, during the flood, you'd get this sinking process as the ocean floors would drop out and the water would rush into those holes. The Bible says the water stood above the mountains. So I think during the first few months of the flood, the animals sorted out and fossils were forming. During the last part of the flood, the plates of the earth are still shifting and they're unstable, and they began to lift up or sink down different places. Thin spots sink down, other places lift up, forming mountain ranges. Water rushes off, forming erosion in a hurry. The Bible says in Psalm 104, at thy rebuke, they fled. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away, talking about the water. It says they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys. Now, many reference Bibles have a footnote right here, because this is an Old English phrase. What this is saying is the mountains arose, the valleys sank down. During the last part of the flood, the mountains actually lifted up. So, was Mount Everest underwater? Mount Everest wasn't there. It formed during the last part of the flood as the mountains lifted up. So that area was underwater. That's how you explain the clams on top, but Mount Everest technically wasn't there until after the flood, or during the flood it formed. The ocean crust is thinner than continental crust. They know this from earthquakes, checking the S&P waves with kind of like doing a sonogram of the earth. They do that all the time. Thinner spots would tend to sink down. Water's going to rush in, filling in these places, causing oceans. The crust of the earth is about 30 miles thick under the continents and about 3 miles thick, 3 to 5 miles thick under the oceans. And the earth all busted up into plates like that. And some are still moving.
Which gets back to our question from part 4. Do sea levels rise or do land masses sink? If there is any truth to this hydroplate flood theory, it seems more likely that the ruins we find 200 feet underwater off the coasts of continents have slid underwater through leftover subduction, either quickly or slowly as ocean crusts collapse or continue to slide. It seems highly unlikely that they could have survived the forces of such a flood event. But who knows? They are crumbled and destroyed, and perhaps they are the remnants of pre-deluge civilizations. Is this what happened to Atlantis? And why are the crusts 30 miles thick under the continents and only 3 to 5 miles thick under the oceans? Were these continents already giant mounds of fallen compost from where ancient forests of 20 to 60 mile high trees were, and the oceans the equivalent of enormous ancient treeless prairies and plains thousands of miles across, lowland valleys that the great floodwaters receded into and settled as our oceans today? And what about our wild speculation that titans may have walked the earth and before the flood, all things were exponentially bigger than today? So open to the possibility that certain dinosaurs were nothing more than much larger and differently micro-evolved ancestors of the same animals that still walk the earth today. Just as Megalodon was to the great white shark, or woolly mammoth to the elephant, saber-tooth to the tiger, and perhaps giants to the titans.
And they've got a new theory now that says maybe a lack of oxygen killed the dinosaurs. A lack of oxygen. Why would they say that? Well, they had a big symposium in 1993. A bunch of scientists got together to study the Apatosaurus. And they said, folks, we've got a problem. An 80-foot Apatosaurus had nostrils the same size as a horse. How is an 80-foot animal going to get enough air through nostrils the same size as a horse? He'd be sucking so hard trying to get a breath, it'd set him on fire from the friction from the wind whistling in there. They couldn't breathe. Well, apparently they did breathe because bones of dinosaurs are found all over the planet. Even in Antarctica and Alaska. I mean, dinosaurs lived everywhere, okay? So how could an 80-foot animal get enough air? Well, today he probably couldn't. Not to get 80 feet long. But I think before the flood came, they had this canopy of air or of water or ice that would increase air pressure. Plus, they had richer oxygen. You know, when they drill into the amber, how many saw the movie Jurassic Park, you know, where they drilled in to get the mosquito blood out? Sometimes in amber, which is petrified tree sap, they find air bubbles in the amber. When they analyze the air bubbles, they find out they're 50% more oxygen than we have today. Man, in the pre-flood world, if they had to double the air pressure and increased oxygen, you would just be full of energy all the time. There's a guy in Japan started raising tomato plants with pressurized carbon dioxide. You know, plants breathe CO2 and not oxygen. This is one tomato plant. It ended up growing 40 feet tall and producing 15,000 tomatoes off one plant. It was a cherry tomato plant, but tomatoes were coming off baseball size off of his.
Obviously, there would have to have been more than 21% oxygen in the air and much greater air pressure than there is today. There would have to be a mechanism as a means of delivering massive amounts of oxygen to the atmosphere, like, for example, photosynthesis from 7 continent-sized jungles or forests, each 20 to 60 miles high, and obviously some kind of sealed container to trap and compress all of that extra gas into massive atmospheric pressure. As for where, then, did the rest of these alleged gargantuan trees go? Did they burn up in a supersonic wind plasma storm? Are they actually the giant petrified mountains today and not crustal basalt and granite? Were they chopped, used, and burned by titans? Are they buried under post-flood sediments and we're all standing on them right now?
So they project the image around the ball, and that's how they came up with the globe.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
That's why it's so hard to convince you you've been fooled.
I thought the globe was more or less a given thing. The more I saw, the more was fake. Was the moon a junkyard, the ISS a sham? When I wanted answers, I got spam. Then I saw the way. Now I'm a flat earther. We're the believers, don't eat the deceivers, those who lie.